Now, as we're looking at my watch, it's exactly 8 o'clock now, Central European time. I hope I'm not too quick now. It looks as if there are many, many people with us already tonight. Dear friends, good evening and a very warm welcome to you all, whether you're in Cologne or somewhere else. A very hearty welcome to a very special event tonight. The next 75 minutes we will spend together, and we will talk about very interesting issues, and we will be celebrating Black History Month 2021 together. I'm very happy to welcome you. My name is Humaira Mansouri. I am heading the section of political education at Volkshochschule Köln. We are a part of the city of Cologne, and I'm very happy to do this job, as I have the privilege to work with fantastic people in the city, and we are very closely linked to Amerikahaus NRW. And I have the opportunity to work on special occasions with Dr. Benjamin Becker, who is here tonight. A warm welcome. And with Katharina Kiefel, they are not just colleagues, they have become friends, and they have become allies, actually, within the last 4 years in which we have been working together on social issues. Yeah, dear friends, the American and the German society, our societies and the individuals that live in them give us so many topics and issues that we have in common, that we need to talk about, that we need to discuss, exchange ideas and perspectives. And the mission that VHS Köln as well as Amerikahaus NRW share is to give people here in the city and in the region and in the communities the opportunity to come together and to share information and ideas about the German-American relationship and about the goings-on in our societies. We are convinced that we all have a responsibility as individuals in a society, and that we need to make clear that we can work on challenges in our societies together, that we can learn from each other, and that we can cooperate. So far, we have had the pleasure to welcome very special persons that would share their ideas with us concerning Black History Month and many other occasions that we talk about together and that we celebrate. And of course, we are all remote witnesses of the goings on in the United States society, especially within the last months. And we were and are very concerned, we are worried, and we are very interested to know more about the details from the persons who live there and bring the situation to us in Cologne. And I'm very proud and happy to be part of this event tonight, as we are introducing 3 extraordinary experts on African American history and society. And a very warm welcome to Professor Clayborne Carson, to Professor Andra Gillespie, and to Professor Britta Waldschmidt-Nelson. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you to Benjamin and Katharina, and thank you all for being here. And we are very happy to share the next 75 minutes with you. Dear Benjamin, it's you now.
Dear Myra, many thanks. I agree with everything that you've said. In the interest of time, I will limit my words and just use this first of all to say hi everyone, to welcome our most distinguished panel, to which I will come in a minute, and also to send a special shout out to this year's CBYX participants who have tuned in. It's part of their extracurricular virtual program. It's a Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange program, and we have some young people tuned in tonight who are using this program as an opportunity to learn. Now, in the interest of our time, we are most honored to welcome a round of leading experts on Black votes, also time witnesses among us, and on civil rights on the virtual stage. 2 of them are from the US, 1 of them is from Germany. And while we would have loved to welcome you in Cologne in person, I mean, it will happen again at some point. The current situation, I mean, I wouldn't talk about opportunities, but maybe it makes it easier to connect. And we are thankful that we could use this opportunity, now I'm saying it, for tonight. I will now briefly introduce Professors Gillespie and Waldschmidt-Nelson, who will then have the honor of introducing Professor Carson. Now, Professor Andra Gillespie is an associate professor of political science and the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference at Emory University in Atlanta. She's an expert on African-American politics, particularly the political leadership of the post-civil rights generation, and a frequent commentator on national television. On a personal note, we're especially thrilled to have her on board, as I spent the most formative year of my whole life as an exchange student at Emory University. I consider that my American alma mater. And my colleague Katarina even spent 2 years of her life in Atlanta, Georgia. So there is a personal connection there. So welcome, Andra Gillespie. Britta Waldschmidt-Nelson is a professor of transatlantic history and culture at the University of Augsburg in Germany. She taught at numerous universities in Germany and the US, and before assuming her current position, she served as deputy director of the German Historical Institute in Washington, DC. 3 years ago, she held a very well-received Martin Luther King Day lecture at the University of Bonn, which we co-hosted. And since then, we've been in close contact and worked closely together. I appreciate that very much, and I welcome you, Britta Waldschmidt-Nelson. Now, I take it that you know Professor Carson personally, so I don't want to spoil this by an anonymous introduction, but I would rather pass it on to you and have you deliver the honor of introducing him. Now, before I do that, final remarks to all of you out there. Please feel invited to participate, because both Volkshochschule and ourselves are all about interactivity. You can click on the Q&A button below, or F&A in the German Zoom version. Submit your questions in writing and we will react to them. And if you enjoyed tonight, please do come back. We all have virtual programs, both organizations. I'm sure you'll find them. Thanks to everyone for preparing tonight. And now, without further ado, on to Professor Britta Waldschmidt-Nelson and to this year's Black History Month discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Becker, for this very kind and generous introduction. And I would like to thank both of you, the Volkshochschule and the Amerikahaus Cologne, for organizing this panel and for inviting us all. It's a great honor and joy to be here. So thanks very much. And I'm also very delighted and honored to be able to introduce Clayborne Carson, Professor Clayborne Carson, to you tonight, because we did meet actually almost 2 decades ago in Munich, when we collaborated back then on introducing the German version of his famous book In Struggle, about the history of SNCC in Munich. So that's when we first met, and I'm a huge fan of Professor Carson and his amazing work and accomplishments. So it's wonderful to be together again on a panel tonight. And I would like to tell you a little bit about his life and academic career, because it's an amazing life, and he has devoted most of it really to the study of Martin Luther King Jr., his writings, and the movements which Dr. King inspired. Clayborne Carson's own academic career began already in 1962 at the University of New Mexico. And at the age of only 19, he met Stokely Carmichael back then and began to become involved in the civil rights movement, including his participation in the famous March on Washington in August of 1963, where he personally witnessed the very famous I Have a Dream speech by Dr. King. And when he got back, he transferred from New Mexico to the University of California, Los Angeles in 1964, and continued his activism there for the movement, while also earning a PhD in history at UCLA, which he completed in 1975. His first book, the one I mentioned before, In Struggle, SNCC and the Black Awakening of the 1960s, was published by Harvard University Press in 1981 and soon won international acclaim. Professor Carson then taught for more than 40 years at Stanford University as the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor of History. And in 1985, at the personal request of Coretta Scott King, he also became director of the King Paper Project, which has since then produced 7 volumes of Dr. King's writings. In 2005, Carson also founded the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Educational Institute at Stanford University to expand the educational outreach of the King Paper Project. And while being officially retired now, he still continues to research and teach at Stanford University and online, giving a lot of online courses, as we just found out. And in addition to the volumes already mentioned, Carson's publications also include other very important books on the African-American freedom struggle. And it would take far too long to list them all here. I just want to point out two. One is Malcolm X, the FBI Files, which gives a really fascinating view of what the FBI did back then to Malcolm X. And a much more recent volume is called Martin's Dream, My Journey and the Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., published in 2013, which is sort of a personal memoir, and I highly recommend it. Of course, I have the book and it's wonderful. Professor Carson also edited the autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. Now, King, of course, never wrote his own autobiography, but Carson was able to compile this text from all the different kinds of Dr. King's autobiographical writings. And this book has also become a huge international success. Finally, let me mention that Professor Carson has been a visiting scholar and taught at dozens of universities inside and outside of the United States. He has appeared on numerous national radio and TV shows, participated in more than 24 documentaries on the civil rights movement. And one I want to point out especially is that he was the senior advisor for the famous public television series, Eyes on the Prize. And for those of you who haven't seen it, it's a must-see. I use it for all my classes on the civil rights movement. So thanks again for doing that. For his amazing accomplishments, Professor Carson has received far too many awards and honorary degrees to be listed here. But I just want to mention one of the more recent one, which I found particularly impressive. In 2018, Clayborne Carson received Jamala Bajai Foundation Award for promoting Gandhian values outside India. And I thought that was beautiful, and it's so fitting because you're sitting in front of the picture of Dr. King and of Mahatma Gandhi. So it all comes full circle, I think. So dear Professor Carson, it's wonderful to see you again after such a long time. Thank you for being here. And I also, of course, want to thank you, Professor Gillespie, so much for joining this panel tonight. I think it's really great. I'm really excited that we have two such outstanding scholars here who come from different academic fields. You know, one from the area of history with an unsurpassed knowledge of Dr. King, and the other a political scientist with great expertise on the current political situation and the voting behavior of African Americans. So I think this will make for a very broad and exciting discussion. So I look forward to it. But now enough introductory talk. Let's get started with the discussion. And as all of you in the audience know, our topic tonight is hashtag Black Votes Matter and hashtag civil rights. And so, of course, a lot of the focus of tonight's discussion will be on current issue, current affairs in the 21st century. However, the thing is that I'm not quite sure how much all of you in the audience really know about African American history. And therefore, I would like to begin our discussion with taking a quick look at the historic background of the situation of Black citizens in the United States today. Since one cannot really understand the significance of the civil rights movement, of Dr. King and his legacy, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement and all the voting, turn out the vote efforts today, without being aware of the fact that it actually took the United States government over a whole century after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865 to actually pass legislation that prohibited the legal discrimination and legal disenfranchisement of Black Americans in the United States. So my first question to the two panelists is the following. In view of the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, what would you say have been some of the most important improvements regarding the social, the economic, and the political situation of African Americans since the 1960s? So the progress on the one hand, and what are the most urgent problems that remain today? Because of that way we can set the stage for moving on from there. And maybe Professor Carson, you would like to start.
Well, I think one way of starting would be to start with Martin Luther King's last book, because as you mentioned, these voting rights legislation and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 were passed, but in 1967, after that, he wrote a book called Where Do We Go From Here? And I think even the title of that book suggests that he felt that the passage of these pieces of legislation had not solved the race problem in the United States. And I think he understood that the racial progress that had been made had created its own backlash. There is something which in the United States we've called the Southern strategy. And it was a desire on the part of the Republican Party after their massive defeat to Lyndon Johnson in 1964, how to get back in power. And they made under Richard Nixon a decision that they were going to try to get the white vote in the South, where the Republican Party had actually been weak. It had historically been a Democratic region of the country, and since the founding of the Democratic Party. And so they felt that by indicating that they were not as eager to move forward on racially progressive legislation as the Democratic Party. And they succeeded in getting tens of millions of white Southerners to move from the Democratic Party, where they had voted, the party they had voted for all their lives, into the Republican Party. And for the last half century, that has been the way in which American politics is divided. As the Republican Party has become the party that's strongest in the South, its base is there. And the Democratic Party has reacted to that by, in some ways, fighting over that question of the, the one way of reversing the gains that the Republican Party would make would be to register and get lots of Black people in the South voting. But over the years, there's been a lot of obstacles to Black voting. And so we've had a series of a dozen or so very close elections, with a few exceptions. And in many of these elections, even when the national vote goes to the Democratic Party, the Republican Party has been able to win. So that's been the political structure of the last half century, is that we've made progress during the 1960s, but almost immediately rapid progress creates its own opposition. And that opposition has been quite strong. We've seen, and I'd be very interested in Professor Gillespie's analysis of this, that maybe the results of the last election suggest that the Southern strategy might have almost come to an end in terms of determining American politics. It's still a very important factor. But the success in Georgia of a Black senatorial candidate and a Jewish senatorial candidate winning the Georgia election, and President Biden winning Georgia. Those three things suggest that that there are signs that we might see another political realignment in America that's going to dominate the next 50 years. But we're still early in that progress. There's still a lot of obstacles to Black voting. I think that it's too easy to read a lot into a single election, but I'm hopeful.
Okay, thank you very much. And we will talk about this election in a lot more detail later. I was wondering maybe to focus a little bit more also still on what happened in the 20th century. Professor Gillespie, would you like to add something?
Sure. So I'm going to show a couple of slides so that we can talk about the political impact of the long civil rights movement in the 20th century. So this slide here was compiled by the Washington Post, but it's drawing data from my colleague, Bernard Fraga, at Emory University. And what we can look at is we can look at Black and white voter turnout in the United States broken out by region. So we're looking at South and in the non-South. And so one of the things that you can see, I've tried to put a line around 1965 to note the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And one of the things that you can see from this line is that Black turnout improves dramatically after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And I would argue that the increase that you're seeing in Black voter turnout leading up to the Voting Rights Act is also a product of civil rights organization. So we can't deny the fact that the landmark civil rights legislation of the 1960s had a significant and positive impact on African Americans' political position in the United States. So whether we're looking at voter turnout here, or we could look at the exponential increase in the number of Black elected officials in the United States. So in 1964, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, there were fewer than 1,000 Black elected officials in the United States today. In the United States, that number has, increased substantially since then. We've had an African-American president. We have an African-American vice president. There are still places where Blacks are still woefully underrepresented in terms of, being involved in legislatures. Fortunately, the U.S. House of Representatives is not one. So we're approaching parity there in terms of Black members of Congress sort of matching the proportion of Blacks in the United States. There's still a very long ways to go in the Senate. There's still been, inconsistent election of Black governors in the United States. So, only 3 Black governors have served in the United States since Reconstruction. But we're also seeing an increase in the number of Blacks, particularly Black women, who are standing up to run for offices, both at the state and at the federal level. So, there are good things to see. The civil rights movement is also really instructive because, as Professor Carson alluded, one of the things the civil rights movement does is it solidifies Black voting behavior. At least it has for the last 50 years. And so this slide is one I regularly show my students. I kind of break it up. So this goes from Franklin Roosevelt through George H.W. Bush, and not much changes after that. So I don't mind showing this particular slide. But one of the things that you can look at is before, through 1960, the Republican Party actually still could garner a significant portion of the African-American vote. So, they weren't winning. Democrats were usually winning by a 2-to-1 margin, but the fact that 20 to 35% of Black voters in the United States still felt comfortable voting for Republicans during the Depression, during World War II, and in the immediate post-war era suggests a relative perceptual parity between the Democratic and the Republican parties on civil rights issues. So you still had a very vocal pro-civil rights wing in the Republican Party, personified by people like Nelson Rockefeller, by people like George Romney, governor of Michigan and father of Mitt Romney. But and then the Democratic Party had to deal with the segregationist wing that was very dominant in politics. And so the Democrats had an image problem. The Republicans had civil rights champions. There were people who had very logical, rational reasons continuing to support the party of Lincoln. What historians like Joshua Farrington would argue is that Blacks who switched over to the Democratic Party did so for economic reasons. They were drawn to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And that certainly makes sense. That starts to change, if you note, by 1964. And so what happens is, part of it is the Southern strategy. But the Southern strategy is hastened or is set off by the fact that Barry Goldwater, representing Western conservatism, refuses to endorse the Civil Rights Act and in fact votes against it as he is the Republican nominee for president in 1964. Most historians would say, he's doing so for libertarian purposes, but it doesn't matter what point you get to at the end of the day, whether you're there for purely racist reasons or there on libertarian principles, not supporting the Civil Rights Act is not supporting the Civil Rights Act. And that sent really important signals to African Americans about where the Republican Party stood on racial issues. So for all the goodwill that the Northeastern liberal wing of the party held, the party was being taken over by Western conservatives who weren't necessarily going to endorse those same ideals and who weren't going to put their necks out on the line. And so African Americans in turn changed their voting behavior. And so it's starting in 1964 that we start to see that pretty consistent voting behavior amongst African Americans, where you won't see more than 20% of African Americans voting for Republican candidates. And so the general rule of thumb is that you can expect that about 10% of Blacks are going to vote Democratic in presidential elections. And if we look at voting behavior, depending on how you count independents who lean Republican, that number is generally in that particular ballpark. So a lot of what gets set up in terms of what we know about current Black political behavior is set up from the long civil rights movement. So Blacks have made rational decisions about how they're going to vote and whom they're going to support based on which party seems to be doing the most for African Americans. Now, that doesn't mean that Blacks are completely in love with the Democratic Party. There are regular complaints about electoral capture and the idea that Democrats take Black votes for granted. But as President Trump found out, even though he made inroads in the 2020 election, you can't just say, well, the other side didn't do things for you if your party is continuing to support white supremacy and continuing to do things that support and undergird the idea that the party has outright hostile interests towards African Americans. So I think I'll stop there, and then happy to sort of, continue to draw on these and other slides for the next questions.
Yeah, but thank you very much, Professor Gillespie. That was great also to see the slides to really show that, because I think one also has to stress with all the problems that are still there, that it has been an incredible increase in participation, in really gaining a place at the decision-making table, as you were saying. In 65, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, we had 500 elected officials. Now it's over 10,000, and it's an all-time high. Members of the House of Representatives, I think it's 57 now, plus for the first time ever 4 African Americans at the same time serving in the United States Senate, and one of them being the Vice President of the United States. That's pretty exciting. And maybe I can just also add that in the other area that we haven't touched on yet, the social and economic area, there has been also tremendous progress. Just to take the example, before 65, in the early 1960s, about half of the African-American population lived below the poverty line. And now it's less than a quarter, depending on how the economy goes. For example, infant mortality rate has been cut in half, the African-American infant mortality rate. The number of Blacks who get a 4-year college degree has increased 6-fold since the 1960s. And of course, there is a lot more, I would say, interest in and respect for African-American history and culture. One of that, looking at this incredibly beautiful museum, the National Museum of African-American History and Culture on the mall right next to the Washington Memorial, on a very prestigious spot. I think there has been a lot of progress, and voting, and participation of Blacks in the institutions of political power, definitely. But at the same time, we all know there are also still significant problems in all the areas mentioned above, lacking healthcare, economic disadvantagement, there is still structural discrimination. And of course, one of the biggest problems, police brutality. And that brings me to my next question before going back into the sort of focusing and zeroing in on the election and politics. I would also like to ask you both, one of the galvanizing moments and movements that also brought out a lot of Black voter turnout is or has been the Black Lives Matter movement. And I would like you both to comment on what you believe the significance of that movement has been, not just for this past election, but really for the last few years since it got started in 2012. Also is commenting, because you brought that up earlier, Professor Gillespie, on the role of Black women in that movement, the non-centralized structure, which is very different from the traditional civil rights movement, and the role of the media in that context. So Black Lives Matter, what's the significance? Professor Carson, do you want to go first again? So we kind of alternate a little bit.
Well, one way of starting the discussion would be to compare my experience being at the March on Washington in 1963 to what happened last spring. Mm-hmm. I remember being amazed by seeing 200,000 people at the March on Washington. I'd never, I grew up in New Mexico, as you pointed out, and so that was the population of New Mexico at that time. And to see all of those people, most of them Black, but a lot of whites also, in one place was very impressive, and it impressed the nation. We still talk about the March on Washington. But after the murder of George Floyd last spring, perhaps 10 times that many people were in the streets within days. And I think that suggests something about the changing demographics of the country, the impact of social media, the way in which movements can be mobilized so much faster and actually become international so much faster than was the case in 1963. So, but I think that's the more positive side of it. But I think the less positive aspect of it is that imagine if only people only over 30 could have responded to George Floyd's murder. My guess is that there wouldn't have been a Black Lives Matter movement. That people over 30 would have seen that, it probably would have still been on the news, but would have responded by saying, I've seen that before. That you had police brutality has been part of my life and the life of many Black people. I was beaten up by Los Angeles police. So I know that problem was there, but I think people of a certain age would say, but what can we do about it? It's been around, that's part of the racist culture of America, and it's expressed in lots of different ways. Culture doesn't change as fast as political attitudes change. So that's deeply rooted in a white supremacist nation. But I think young people looked at that and said, well, I haven't seen that before, and I don't want to see it again, and it can be changed. And for them, their cultural experience is quite different from people who are older. They've grown up in a world, first of all, it's a post-Cold War world, and you can see that from youth support for Bernie Sanders' campaign. He ran as a socialist, and that would have been almost impossible to imagine during the Cold War. But they've grown up after the Cold War. They've also grown up in a much different American society in which the cultural cues that they follow are as much created by Black Americans as white Americans. And they're the people they admire have changed dramatically. So I think that divide, demographic divide between young and old helped fuel this movement. And they've also grown up in a world that is what I would call the post-civil rights change. That is, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was followed by the growth of the women's movement, the gay rights movement. So many other movements kind of took their tactics and their strategies from the civil rights movement of the mid-1960s and applied them to other areas of discrimination and human rights. And so they've grown up in that era where these kinds of issues are much more, they have much broader cultural resonance. And so I think that accounts for how quickly Black Lives Matter became an international movement, and also as you mentioned, the fact that they followed. I was asked a lot of times about the lack of centralized leadership, and I said, well, that was the SNCC wing, that was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating. That was what they tried to do. That was their way of countering King by saying that we're not following King. King is following us. We're the vanguard of the movement. And that attitude was around in the 60s. And I think, I don't want to take credit for it because I'm sure that a lot of the people who organized it had not read my book in order to do that. But they had certainly picked up a lot of the lessons that decentralized grassroots leadership is a strength of a movement, not a weakness. That having centralized leadership can also be a weakness because the leader can be eliminated, can be imprisoned. Lots of other things can happen. So I see that as very hopeful. I think the fact that it is young people bodes well for the future, and that young people will constantly be replaced by other young people who have had even similar experiences of growing up under a Black president, and all of these kinds of experiences that's going to shape them in the future, while us older people are a declining proportion of the electorate. And so I think that that's very hopeful, although, as I would point out, a lot of the people who invaded the Capitol on January 6th, the extreme right-wing white supremacist ring, included people who were not teenagers, but certainly people who were not my age either. So it's going to be interesting to see how that works out in the future. My guess is that every year more people turn 18, and they demographically they just represent a different political perspective, and I think that's hopeful for the country.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Carson. Also, thanks for pointing out the similarity, which I think a lot of people sort of don't recognize between SNCC and Black Lives Matter movement, and also with regard to the important role of women. Because of all the civil rights organizations back then, SNCC was the one with by far the most gender equality, with a lot of female leadership, and Ella Baker inspiring that very much. And I think the role of women has been tremendously important in the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'll turn it over to you, Professor Gillespie. How do you view that whole impact of Black Lives Matter and the role of women?
Well, I mean, I see Black Lives Matter as an extension of the mid-20th century civil rights movement. And I don't think you get Black Lives Matter without having had the long civil rights struggle in the the middle part of the 20th century. Part of the reaction, like what animates Black Lives Matter, is the idea that the work of the 20th century civil rights movement was left undone. So one of the big lessons that we learned from that is that you can give Blacks political rights, but that doesn't necessarily translate into people getting full economic and social rights. And so there were more things that were left to tackle. From an attitudinal standpoint, I think what many people learned from the civil rights movement was, that we start to see decreases in the percentage of people who believe in the biological inferiority of Blacks relative to whites, for instance. And we certainly see in our culture, up until Donald Trump, sort of a certain social, acceptability in terms of, using overt racial slurs and saying things that were overtly racist. And so there were certain norms of equality that were ushered in as a result of the civil rights movement. But people still disagree on the other things that would actually promote true equality. So people believe in equality, but if we break it down and talk about equality of opportunity versus equality of results, so in other words, if we start to see disparate impacts on the back end, right, you will see cleavages there where some people assume that there's equality of opportunity. And so therefore, if we see differences in outcomes, well, it's an individual thing. It can't be anything that's structural. In public opinion data that I've collected through the James William Johnson Institute, we also see less that not everybody really understands what structural racism is, right? They can understand you shouldn't use racial slurs, you shouldn't commit hate crimes against people. But when we start to talk about other things like, if you're setting up, waste dumps in poor communities or, communities of color, that's racist, right? Because they don't go into white neighborhoods, right? A lot of people have a harder time wrapping their head around that. And so that's the terrain on which there's still a lot of room to fight. And moreover, when we look at issues related to policing, these are issues that have beset the United States for centuries. Stories about police brutality are not new. We could think about their connections when, I was the age of many of my students, especially at that transition from college to graduate school. We were dealing with the beating of Abner Louima and the death of Amadou Diallo, sort of very much in the same way, having the same visceral reactions that we've seen people react to the deaths of people like Mike Brown and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. I remember being in graduate school and reading about incidences of police brutality that, from accounts from 1895 that sounded like somebody could have written them in 1995, or 1999. So yeah, that issue still hasn't been addressed. And so what you see is people making policy proposals about how to address these structural problems, but actually confronting the fact that not everybody knows how to deal with them. And then also, you know, this is definitely sort of an extension of the civil rights movement, because the organizers of Black Lives Matter have been heavily influenced by intersectional theory. I mean, and these are people who, you know, have come through, they've taken African-American studies classes, they were African-American studies majors in college, depending on where your local leadership is, sometimes they are professors in these fields, right? And so they know that, you know, one of the blind spots of the long civil rights movement in the 20th century was how women were integrated and how their leadership was honored. And then also the politics of respectability. And so when you see, one, the fact that it's 3 queer Black women who, you know, sort of created the moniker Black Lives Matter and the hashtag. And then if we look at the sort of importance of, you know, of women in the leadership, the importance of the LGBTQ identified people within the movement, and the idea that Black Lives Matter will advocate for all Black people and not just put forward the respectable looking ones like Rosa Parks, sort of, you know, as opposed to Claudette Colvin, excuse me, that, you know, that they're going to advocate for everybody. They are doing that in response to what they think is a shortcoming of the long civil rights movement of the 20th century, and a longstanding critique of what happened in that movement. So I think the larger question is, you know, the civil rights movement of the mid 20th century focused on consensus issues so that they could get some gains. And Black Lives Matter seems resistant to that type of narrowing for fear that it might exclude some. So what we'll know in a few years is whether or not that broad approach is actually going to lend itself to some massive policy changes and gains that will, you know, end up affecting and improving the lot of all African Americans. But I think they're also very their continuity. So like when I teach this with my students, you know, we talk about sort of the networks and the phone trees and the mimeograph machines of the 1950s and phone trees, right? That was cutting edge technology. That is no different than people using Instagram and Snapchat and Twitter and Facebook to organize rallies today, right? You're just using whatever technology is available to you. And similarly, the idea that young people tended to be the most radical and the most willing to put their bodies on the line, that's the same. And I think that that's true for every generation. So I'm also not surprised. Sometimes I live in Atlanta, you know, where, especially when Black Lives Matter was, you know, trying to disrupt traffic in some places, and Andy Young came out and criticized them heavily, and perhaps intemperately, right? It's not surprising that an elder would tell a younger group of people, hey, you're doing it wrong. Like that fight's been going on forever and we should all expect it. And my students have the hardest time understanding that 25 years from now, you're gonna be Andy Young and you're gonna tell a young activist that they're doing something wrong. And they're gonna tell you back in 2015 or 2018 or 2021, yeah, that was nice, but here's what you missed. I was like, you have to be prepared for that. That's just part of sort of like a natural generational kind of life cycle thing. And I see sort of what's happening now very much as being sort of, you know, in sort of, you know, that same spirit and in that same trajectory of history. And I just want to see sort of how far this takes us as a society and what new freedoms we acquire as a result of the organizing that's going on.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I completely agree with what you said. It is very hopeful to see so many young people using the technology that they have and their courage and their spirit to make things better. And perhaps especially with regard to police brutality, when we think about Malcolm X already fought about this. King spoke out against it. As you were saying, Professor Gillespie, it's been a problem that's been around for a long, long time. And of course, some of the slogans like defund the police were very, very controversial. But at the same time, we see now in several cities that there has been some changes, that whole police departments have been sort of destructured, restructured, that there are making actual efforts to change something. And it remains to be seen if that will be successful or not. I certainly hope so. And one thing that's very encouraging, I believe, was the international really outpouring of support. I mean, when George Floyd was killed there, a few days later, there was this rally in all over German cities, and one was in Munich, and this was Corona lockdown, okay? So you weren't really supposed to go out, and we all had to wear face masks, and I was attending this rally on Odeonsplatz in Munich together with my youngest daughter, and 500 people were supposed to participate. That's what they were expecting, 500 to 1,000 people. We ended up being 20,000 people. 20,000 people in Germany, in Bavaria, okay? So of course, a large majority of them were white Germans, but they were all really there to support the cause. And I found that very encouraging. But I'm looking at my clock here and time is racing. So I do want to move forward now to the topic of Black political participation in the United States. We've already seen there has been so much progress. And that's very encouraging, the numbers. But of course, there are very important questions that remain regarding really the effectiveness of an increase in number of African-American politicians onto the decision-making process. What really was the turnout? Like, a lot of people were kind of disappointed of. We had a Black president for 8 years, but he didn't really significantly improve the economic situation of African-Americans, maybe with the exception of the Affordable Care Act. So there are also questions popping up about what does Black politics mean in the 21st century? Is there such a thing, for example, as post-racial Black leadership? And I know the term post-racial has been highly controversial. And Professor Gillespie, you actually published a couple of books on this question, focusing, among other things, on the role of Cory Booker as a representative of this new type of modern Black politician. Can you explain what you mean by post-racial Black leadership and what you see as some of the major differences and why that is important to 21st century Black politics?
Sure. So first, post-racial is in the title of my first 2 books because my editors made me do it, not because I wanted it. So I don't actually believe in post-racialism. The fact that there's a Black Lives Matter movement today proves that, like, we are not past race at all. But what I am interested in, particularly amongst politicians who are a little bit older now, so Gen Xers, so in their 40s and 50s, who were coming of age politically and starting to run for office right around and at the turn of the century, there was a tendency, because of their aspirations for statewide and political office, to try to run racially transcendent campaigns for office. So they, especially if they didn't have ties to the Black leadership strata already, because they weren't part of those families or hadn't been mentored by them, they would be more likely to challenge other Black elected officials for power. And they would do so under the guise of sort of civil rights inflected leadership is inspiring, but it hasn't actually produced gains in Black communities. And in particular, looking at the municipal level, where there are numbers of cities where Blacks are in the majority numerically from a population standpoint, and where Blacks had held political power for a long period of time, you weren't seeing changes in those communities that would have benefited the whole. And so the younger group came in and they argued that because of the civil rights movement, they had been allowed to acquire the technocratic skills that would allow them to do a better job in management, as opposed to their activist elders who may have won a political office as a result of the work that they had done in the 1960s and 70s. And my work on Booker says that, while the claim was attractive, if we actually look at numbers, the success, the track record was better in some ways, but it's not necessarily astronomically better. And that's not to take anything away from now Senator Booker's performance as mayor, of Newark, New Jersey. But like sometimes some of this was a lot of public relations. And the other sort of part of that is, looking at sort of like what that means. One, even when you run a racially transcendent campaign and position yourself as a racially transcendent politician, you still have to deal with, 1, racism, and 2, you have to deal with the structural limitations of your job. And so like sometimes there are things that you can't turn around, or you can't turn it around in 1 to 2 terms in office. I wrote another book, second book on President Obama. So both of them are the monographs are right over my shoulder, where I do take issue with the critique that Obama did nothing for Blacks. Like, that's not true at all. But we can look at the things that he did do. We can talk about the things that worked and the things that didn't work, but then we can also look at how African Americans perceived the performance of President Obama. And that was largely positive, in part because African Americans either because of jaundice or because of, you know, a keen sort of understanding that it takes a long time to turn around 400 years of racism and oppression, they got what they expected out of the Obama presidency. And so people were largely satisfied. And when they weren't satisfied, President Obama paid a price for it in terms of sort of, you know, his approval ratings or how enthusiastic people were to vote to reelect him in 2012. And so I think we shouldn't discount that a lot, but we should also acknowledge the things that happened and know that some of those happened behind the scenes, and that many of the people who are highly critical of President Obama are academics who sometimes wanted him to do things that structurally, based on, you know, separation of powers, might have been a little bit outside of the grasp of what any president could be able to do. And also just from the time frame, like you're not going to be able to turn around 400 years of history in an 8-year term. So I tend to be a little bit more sympathetic towards President Obama with respect to that. And even with respect to now Senator Booker, right? I just want to talk about sort of like, there is the way that like friends in the media would talk about him, and then there was what happened on the ground in Newark. And I just want to provide a little bit more of a balanced view about what was going on there. But what I also want to do and acknowledge, and I do towards the end of the book on Obama, is to talk about how that looks different now. So the racial transcendence of the early 2000s has given way to activism, even amongst those who were naturally primed to be transcendent. And so in the era of Black Lives Matter, in the era of a racially divisive president who aligns himself with white supremacists, right, even the most transcendent Black politicians cannot sort of do the kumbaya, can't we all get along? And let me tell you about my pro-charter school policy kind of posture, because that doesn't resonate as much with Black voters. So we have seen over time that even the deracialized Black politicians have become more radical in terms of their willingness to talk about race because it's unavoidable, right? And so because it's unavoidable, they have stepped into that. And they, you know, a Cory Booker or even a Kamala Harris doesn't sound like Cori Bush, right? So there are still these stylistic differences that one can notice and tease out, but everybody agrees. And so the consensus issues have changed. Sometimes they're still the same old ones. And so it's now considered radical or progressive to be, you know, supportive of voting rights. But like that should be a no-brainer for all African Americans, and people are doing so because of the assault against voting rights that we've seen happen. So first at the courts, and now even as we speak right now, debates in state legislatures about how to make voting harder for people as opposed to easier.
Right. Which actually brings me right to my next question regarding the obstacles to equal access to the ballot, which have been increasing. And Professor Carson, you pointed some of those out, and I want to focus maybe a little bit on this issue again. What do you think were sort of how did the people who wanted to exclude African Americans go about this exclusion? What has been very effective there? And on the other hand, where do you see what are the most necessary and successful steps to counter these efforts to disenfranchise African Americans and other people of color that we have been seeing?
Well, I think the first thing I would point out is that voting is unnecessarily difficult in the United States, and it has been throughout its history. We think of ourselves, at least some think of ourselves, as a democratic country, but from the beginning, I mean, there were property restrictions. Only white men with property could vote. There were, you know, other kinds of restrictions. Obviously, women couldn't vote. Historically, Black people couldn't vote at all. They were not, you know, with the Dred Scott decision of the 19th century, they were not considered even citizens of the country. So when you compare the United States to other nations where there was an assumption that everybody who was there was a citizen, or at least, you know, the vast majority were citizens, and deserved full voting rights, that situation has never existed in America. And it still doesn't exist. I mean, it's still unnecessarily difficult because of these historical factors that, you know, one of the things that you can see from the Eyes on the Prize, which you mentioned, is that back in the 1960s, if you wanted to vote in many counties, rural counties, you had to go to the county seat and go to the, the county office where the voter registrar was. Imagine someone who is a farmer 20 some miles away who doesn't even have a car, and you have to go to this building, which if you went there as a Black person, they would wonder, why are you even there? So, even the notion of registration, and some of that is class-based. The requirement that you be resident in the area, you have to be in some places registered 6 months before the election. So when we compare the percentage of people voting in the United States to most countries in the world, including some which we would consider dictatorships, the percentage of people who actually go to the polls is much higher than in the United States. They have things like multi-day voting, weekend voting, so that you don't have to miss time at work. All of these reforms that are obvious, that could be easily done, that would make voting easier for everyone. I think that was one of the fortunate results of the pandemic, is that faced with the reality that many middle-class white Americans would have trouble getting to the polls, the restrictions were loosened, so that you could multi-day voting, voting before election day, mail voting, all of these reforms that were always possible, but very purposely resisted, and mostly resisted in the southern states and sometimes in the rural states also. That there would be this distinction between making it easy for rural people to vote, because of course, they can't, they would have to go to a polling place, but making it harder for urban people to vote. So even within states, you have these differences in terms of the barriers to voting. So I'm hopeful again that that because of what happened in the last election, where in some cases these rules were stricken down because of COVID, that we're not going to go back to the old rules. But that's even in this last election, you see examples of people waiting hours to vote. I'm sitting here in Palo Alto. It takes me 3 minutes to vote. So I know what the other side looks like. And when I get home after quickly casting my ballot, I look on the television and see those long lines and just wonder how dedicated those people must be to stand in line for hours in order to do something that you should be able to do from your home.
Right.
We don't even do our banking by going to the bank. Why should we do our voting by having to go to a centralized voting place? Yeah. So I think that kind of change is going to be harder to do, but I think that it'll bring us closer to a democratic society.
Right. Yes. Thank you. And I'm again looking at the clock. That's why I'm having to wrap that topic up a little bit now. But I totally agree with you. One, I think, hopeful thing is that when Shelby County versus Holder was passed, the Supreme Court decision in 2013, which kind of really disabled parts of the Voting Rights Act, people, I think, were very afraid that minority voter participation would plummet. And I think it's due to the countering efforts and the incredible sort of grassroots level organizing by people such as Stacey Abrams in Georgia that didn't happen. I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Gillespie, but I believe actually that the Black voter turnout has not gone down a lot in recent years. In fact, that it was very high last year, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, so, voter turnout went up across the board because people cared an awful lot about this election. And so, I think that that's great. What I don't want to have happen is to have America descend into chaos. And that's the reason why people show up and vote. Like, I want people to vote when, the president isn't divisive. And I want people to vote when, there isn't a pandemic, and to take that seriously. So when your elected leaders are boring and they're kind of doing what you want to do, you should take that responsibility seriously. one of the other things that happened is that turnout also goes up when you ask people to vote. And so there was a greater concerted effort at trying to get people to turn out to vote. It's how Donald Trump increased his numbers in an absolute numerical sense. And it is how increases in communities of color went up. So it's particularly for Asian American and Latino communities, people assume that they're not citizens and they don't ask them to go vote. And we wonder why their turnout lags Blacks and whites. And so if you ask people to vote, they will turn out to vote. So I hope that we remember those lessons and remember that we should ask everybody to vote regardless of what they look like. But, you know, I think the other issue that goes along with this in terms of counteracting Shelby County versus Holder, you know, there's pending legislation in Congress right now that seeks to correct the parts of the Voting Rights Act that were invalidated by that particular ruling. And there are things that have happened as a result of that. So when Shelby County versus Holder was rendered and pre-clearance goes away, North Carolina and Texas instituted voter ID laws that had been held up by the Justice Department. There have, and while we can't detect an effect, right, there were localities that had been covered by the Voting Rights Act that made changes to polling locations. And they maybe have done so with the intent, or, you know, somebody may have done it with the intent of trying to depress turnout. Just because it didn't have the effect doesn't mean that if I can prove intent that I won't cry dirty pool. Right. And so like there are different types of voter suppression. There's intended suppression and then there is actual suppression. And so intended suppression is bad even if it doesn't work. And, you know, actual disenfranchisement is bad even if it wasn't intended to be discriminatory. And so we have to be pretty vigilant about all of them, and sometimes be really and acknowledge the fact that some of the motivation behind voter ID laws in the aughts or today, you know, eliminating no excuses absentee ballots because people told lies about you know, the election being fraudulent, right, are, you know, have their basis and have their motivation in attitudes and behaviors that are wrong, that are either straight up not true or out and out racist. So, so you know, it doesn't matter that you know, civil rights activists are hip to the game and know how to tell people, okay, here's how to avoid the trap, but I want to get rid of the trap.
Right. And the advantage now is that legislation that has been pending and was killed in the Senate a couple of years ago, I think now that we have a majority, well, a one vote majority in the Senate, maybe it will actually pass. And that would be a great step towards protecting African-American and other minority group voting rights. We do want to open this up to the audience in a minute. I just wanted to ask one last question, and I would like both of you to keep your answers comparatively short so we can open this up to the audience. But I don't want to end without asking both of you of your view of the new Biden administration. I mean, the Biden administration has a cabinet that's arguably the most diverse cabinet ever with regard to gender, race, class, ethnicity. And on his first day in office, Biden issued the executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. So what are your hopes? Do you think this is all just tokenism, or will there be an actual change that the Biden administration can accomplish, as much as one can accomplish in 4 years? So, Professor Carson, do you want to go first?
Well, as a historian, I will always say, we'll see. We'll see after some time. You know, because you know, I think everyone recognizes that not all Black politicians or political figures have the same attitudes, and some are themselves incremental and don't feel that you should risk a major defeat. So you know, that's going on right now with the response to the COVID pandemic is, you know, do you compromise before you even get the vote? Or do you go and try to get it through, even if you get it through by one vote? And I think that's going to apply even more to the departments, because there are a lot of vested interests out there who are going to resist. And we still have the problem of the influence of money and power on the political system. And many of the same, we have the revolving door of many of the people who come into government are from the business sector. And when they leave government, they'll go back into that sector. And so I think that, and that's true for Black as well as white people in government. So so I think we'll see. What I hope, obviously, is that they think in a long term. It took a lot to for Obama to get the Affordable Care Act passed. It squeaked through, and he had to pay a lot of political costs to get it. It basically led to the development of the Tea Party movement, which led to Donald Trump. And so I think that political price was worth it because the Affordable Care Act is something that is still there. It's institutionalized. So unless we have a dramatic political change, some version of it, hopefully a better version of it, will be around in 10 years or 20 years. Right. And it's those kinds of changes that you really want to focus on, not things that are going to be, do people get a $1,400 check to get them through, pay their rent for 1 month, but rather, something like increasing the minimum wage is much more important because it's not likely to go backward. That'll be the floor. So I'm still waiting. As a historian, I look at things in a longer term. In fact, I have a history textbook, and my job has always been the hardest because my part of the textbook keeps getting longer. Every new president, I have to go back and rewrite the last chapter.
Thank you so very much. And Professor Gillespie, what's your expectations and hopes for the Biden administration? Briefly.
So I'm not surprised, at the reversals that happen. I'm not even surprised at the pace of the reversals because they happened very, very quickly, almost immediately when President Biden took office. And so, yeah, I do expect a difference in tone. I do expect the policy focus to be a little bit different. I think, though, that the lesson of the Obama administration is you can't just rest on the laurels of descriptive representation to make sure that Black interests get represented and that they manifest themselves in terms of policy. If African Americans want to make sure that their interests are being considered, they're going to have to, stay in President Biden's face, and they're going to have to make continual demands and make their preferences known. So, it's not just relying on one prime mover or one administration to do things. There's a lot of agency that people have in order to say what they want and to hold elected officials accountable.
Thank you very much. And now we will finally open this up to the audience. And I have a few questions here that came in. The first one is to both of you. The question is, we know about the strong Black-Jewish alliance in the civil rights movement, but also about the increasing tensions in the 70s and 80s, Farrakhan, affirmative action, Williamsburg, etc., until today, BDS, post-colonialism, etc. Therefore, it's more than remarkable that a Black and Jewish candidate managed to organize such a unified campaign and win with an almost identical coalition of voters. And he's, of course, the questioner referring to Georgia. What's behind the success story, and what are the lessons to learn to overcome previous tensions and to revitalize the Black-Jewish alliance of the civil rights movement? And I would ask you both to keep your answers short because we have a few more questions. Who wants to go for that one?
I'll start. The short answer is party identification, right? It mattered that there were D's behind both of their names. In reality, John Ossoff, was mentored by John Lewis. So it's not surprising that he would have really strong ties to the African-American community. And despite what people tried to say about Raphael Warnock, he also had very strong ties to the Jewish community as well. So, the reason why they got elected with identical coalitions in Georgia in particular was they were Democrats. And so, these were pretty much joint campaigns. And so there wasn't going to be split ticket voting, especially given the fact that control of the Senate was at stake.
All right, thank you. Professor Carson?
I would agree that there's always been issue. Now, there's no coalition that's perfect. You're always going to have some issues that you agree on, some issues you disagree on. And I think the major thing is to to keep the coalition together, you have to decide what are you gaining from it. And I think it'll be around for a while, but the notion that there's tensions in the relationship, say over attitudes about Israel and the Palestinians, that's going to be, these issues are going to always pop up.
Yes, and they will probably remain. Okay, moving on to the next question. Often minorities do not have much trust in politics and its possibilities to help them, especially after the last years. How can the trust be restored, or how can the influence of minorities be increased? And maybe the restored trust, if I may add to that, one thing that was surprising for many people is that Donald Trump managed to get 20% of the Black male vote in this last election. So maybe one can add, how can the Democratic Party restore more trust and support within the Black community?
So this wasn't the first time that there was a gender gap between Black men and Black women in presidential elections. In fact, there's usually been one for a long period of time. It's important to know that because of many reasons, not least of which is felon disenfranchisement, Black women make up a larger proportion of Black voters than, say, white women make up of white voters. It's important to understand that Black women's votes, in terms of trying to explain the overall African-American vote, actually are weighted a little bit more heavily than they are for African-American men. So, some people might attribute what we saw in exit polls to some type of sampling error. I'm not going to be willing to go there, and it's going to take us a long time to actually try to figure out what the gender gap is. And so there are competing people who are going to try to explain it. Donald Trump certainly made appeals to Blacks based in classic theories of Black capitalism, which the Republican Party has tried to use to court African-American voters since the days of Richard Nixon. And so he appealed to that. I mean, I think that's why the rapper Ice Cube, for instance, was drawn to Donald Trump. But that usually doesn't appeal to the vast majority of African Americans. And I think it's important to point out that, almost 80% of Black men voted for Joe Biden. So we're talking about a really small proportion of African Americans overall that, voted for Donald Trump and were attracted to this particular message. One of the other things that, we will look at is whether or not, sexism amongst Black men might keep them from supporting female candidates, both Hillary Clinton. It probably wouldn't have had the same type of effect with Kamala Harris in 2020 because she's the VP candidate and not the presidential candidate. But there are, lots of reasons why we may, see some of the differences that we observe. But I think it's also important to emphasize that those differences are, relatively speaking, small.
Right, and Professor Carson, the question of the member of the audience was especially how can the trust be restored? How can the Democratic Party gain the trust back?
By delivering things that people can see. That the changes. What I was mentioning earlier about changes that will last. If you and also understand what the source is. For example, people who go to their county health clinic without recognizing that clinic wouldn't exist without the Affordable Care Act. Sometimes I think that the government needs to do a better job of really making clear what it is delivering, and sometimes in healthcare that's a little bit hard to see. But I think just delivering tangible gains, not symbolic gains, but tangible gains. That's what, if you're on Social Security, that's coming from the government. And that took a piece of legislation that was controversial in its time. Medicare, the same thing. Those are, now what happens unfortunately is that people become so used to it that they don't recognize that as a political gain that had to be fought for.
Yeah, but as you mentioned earlier, I think one of the most tangible gains that could be delivered now by this new administration and using the majorities in Congress would be a major increase of the minimum wage, because that would really make a difference in people's lives, I think. Okay, next question from the audience. What do the statistics look like for the 2008 and 2016 election in regard to the Black vote chart? I assume the person means for Black voter turnout, or how they voted in 2008 as compared to 2016.
So I'm gonna do this off the top of my head, so I might be off by a couple of numbers. So one, if we look at Black voter turnout in 2008 and 12, it was high. So if we use census data, it's roughly tied, maybe slightly behind white voters in 2008. In 2012, it surpasses white voters. So that was the first time that had ever happened in census data. And then if we look at overall vote choice, the numbers are about 95% of Blacks voted for Obama in 2008. And I think the number was about between 94 and 96% in 2012. We do see the percentage of Black men voting Republican going up from 2008 to 2012. But if we look at Black women, it was about 96% of Black women who were voting Democratic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And yeah, and that's the end of our question. I'm just seeing we don't have any more open questions from the audience. And we're actually right on time because we were supposed to finish at 9:15. So this is excellent. And of course, I have a list here of about 10 more questions that I would love to discuss with you, but I think we should probably postpone that to some other time. I think what has become apparent through our conversation is that there has been a lot of progress and that there are a lot of hopeful signs with regard to the mobilization of the Black community and also with regard to mobilizing the Black voter turnout and continuing to do so in recent years, but that there also continuous challenges exist that need to be overcome and that one has to be, I think you said it, Professor Gillespie, very vigilant. And it would be my hope for the Biden administration that they can use these first 2 years where they still have that slight majority in Congress to push as much laws through the Congress that will bring those tangible results that you, Professor Carson, mentioned that will make a difference in people's lives. And one has to be, I think, particularly careful and maybe that was one last question I have to you. The thing that got lost in a lot of people looking at the fact that everybody was just so relieved that Joe Biden won this election and that Donald Trump was voted out of office, that I think a lot of people didn't notice that the Republicans actually gained. They gained 17 seats in the House of Representatives. They didn't lose enough Senate seat to really give a strong majority. They did not lose a single state legislature. I think the Democrats had hoped to pick up at least 2 or 3. Instead, the Republicans won 3 more. So now they hold the majority they control 2/3 of all the state legislatures in the United States. And this in a redistricting year, because I'm not sure if our audience knows it, but every 10 years there's a census in the United States, and then the redistricting starts, and that is done, which to Germans is always very confusing. How can you allow political parties to do redistricting? And so, of course, the parties in power use that redistricting to their advantage. And so I worry about that, about how the redistricting will now be handled by a country that's 2/3 in Republican hands, and how much that could have of an impact for the coming 10 years. So, but I don't know how. Maybe as a closing word, what are your hopes and fears for the future?
I would just definitely something to be sorry. I mean, that's definitely something to be concerned about, and it's going to take sort of addressing it on multiple fronts. So an electoral strategy, there's still a litigation strategy. There's a legislative strategy. If Congress wanted to ban partisan gerrymandering, there's an argument, a constitutional argument that they should do it. There's still a lot of interesting terrain on which to fight for the next few years. So there's still, a lot of work left to do.
Right, thank you. And Professor Carson.
I think it just points to the difference between temporary changes and more long-term changes. That we have to, if you want to make America more democratic, that has to be a continuing effort, because it's built into the structure of this country to be anti-democratic, and to undo those structures, like redistricting, like giving preferences to smaller, more rural states. That was from the start of the country to this day, if you are a rural farmer, you have more impact on who runs the country than if you're an urban resident. And that was very purposeful. You know, I remember reading in Jefferson talking about the urban masses add nothing to the nation, you know, because they don't have property.
Right, it's the yeoman.
Yeah, that's right. So but again, it's going to take time, and I think, I hope that people in the Democratic Party understand that these structural issues have to be addressed. As Professor Gillespie points out, sometimes trying to pass laws, but then you have the Supreme Court that can overturn those laws. So it's going to be difficult.
Yeah, it's definitely continuing to be challenging, but maybe we can quote Dr. King one more time here at the end, since he's standing behind me and standing behind you, Professor Carson, and he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it's bent towards justice." So let's hope that that will come true in the end and that things will progress. And with that, we are really at the end of our time now. And I would like to use this opportunity to thank our organizers one more time, the Volkshochschule in Köln, the Amerikahaus Cologne, and both of you very, very much. It was a great pleasure to meet you, Professor Gillespie, and it was wonderful to see you again, Professor Carson. And I hope one day when this horrible pandemic has become finally a nightmare from the past, we will be able to meet in person again too, and then maybe have a glass of wine together. Thank you also to all the people in the audience for your patience, for being with us tonight. And I wish everybody a wonderful evening, or for you guys in the States, a wonderful rest of the day. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.